Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Later in the show, I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. We're going to talk about RFK Junior, his Senate hearings. Will he be confirmed as Health Secretary for the United States? That will, of course, have global implications, especially when it comes to disease control. There's already been some bad news on that front with Donald Trump, hasn't there? We'll be showing you some clips, some of the key moments. And we're going to end by talking about Roman Abramovitch, who seems to have conned us out of £1 billion, which is a shame. We begin, though, with Rachel Reeves' big announcement today. I've got a really interesting guest on whether or not flying can ever be made green. Rachel Reeves has given another speech on growth today, and shock horror, she wants more of it, lots more of it, and she really, really wants it, not just a little bit, a lot. You'll, of course, have heard all of that before. This is what she likes to say. People want to see it, though. This speech, though, did have something which made it stand out, an announcement that made some headlines. Let's take a look.
I have always been clear that a third runway at Heathrow would unlock further growth, boost investment, increase exports, and make the UK more open and more connected. And now the case is stronger than ever, because our reforms to the economy, like speeding up the planning system and our plans to modernise UK airspace, means the delivery of this project is now set up for success. So I can confirm today that this government supports a third runway at Heathrow.
Now, whether or not an airport gets a new runway might sound like a technocratic issue, and obviously Rachel Reeves has somewhat a delivery which is somewhat technocratic, let's say. It's not particularly inspiring. However, Rachel Reeves has today written a new chapter in a drama that has dragged on for over 20 years. It's gone on for so long. More than half of my life we have been debating whether to have a third runway at Heathrow. The plan was first proposed in 2003 by Heathrow, sort of by the organisation that owns it, so 22 years ago. Back then, it was already a controversial move. That was because Heathrow's owners had already built a fifth terminal at the airport, and they'd done so on the proviso it would not need an extra runway, that being, of course, controversial with the locals. Nonetheless, that same year, the Labour government suggested they would support the move, and that then led to protests. Most prominently, the Camp for Climate Action in 2007 set up in Sipsons, that's a village that looks set to be destroyed to build the new runway. You can see clashes with police there. And those protesters won a surprising ally in 2008. Then opposition leader David Cameron said he would block the scheme. Cameron called Brown support for a third runway pig-headed. And another Tory, whose constituency was below Heathrow's flight path, also spoke out against the plan.
My constituents face the prospect of a reduction in their quality of life with more planes flying overhead, the prospect of being restricted in driving their cars locally, and a far worse train service under Crossrail.
Cameron and May would go on to beat Labour, of course, at the 2010 election, and the Tory Lib Dem coalition immediately scrapped Labour's plans for a third runway. But with the election behind them and desperate for growth, by 2012, Cameron and George Osborne put a third runway back on the agenda. That led to a split in the coalition, with Clegg saying the Lib Dems would never back expansion. And many of Cameron's own MPs threatened a rebellion over the plans. And by this point, Labour themselves, this time under Ed Miliband, were also opposed to the plans which they themselves had approved less than 5 years earlier. But in 2015, Cameron faced an even bigger problem. London Mayor Boris Johnson stood in as MP and said this.
John McDonnell, yes, John, I will join you. I will join you. I will lie down with you in front of those bulldozers and stop the building, stop the construction of that building.
So that was Boris Johnson when he was running for Uxbridge, of course, so a constituency close to Heathrow, saying that he would lie down on the ground in front of bulldozers before he would approve a new runway at Heathrow. Of course, at that point, he was running on a manifesto that did propose Heathrow expansion. So David Cameron in 2010, he was against it. In 2015, he was for it. Boris Johnson in 2015, against it. And again in 2016, also, this time as Foreign Secretary, against it.
I'm afraid to say, I think that Heathrow in the long term is not in the right place, and I'm afraid a third runway is undeliverable.
So Boris Johnson against it, but by this point, Prime Minister Theresa May, who beforehand had said she was against it, is now in favour of it. She puts it to Parliament. She wins a vote on expansion in 2018. Boris Johnson, at the time, created controversy by finding a way to skip the vote by jetting off to Afghanistan on the same day. So brave. A little bit creative, I suppose you've got to give him that. The long saga then went to the courts. In February 2020, the Court of Appeal blocked the runway on the basis it wasn't consistent with our climate obligations. In December that year, the Supreme Court overturned that ban, saying it could go ahead. But COVID, as well as several years of Tory leadership chaos, kept the issue off the table until now. So over the past 15 years, everyone's supported it, everyone's opposed it. It's going back and forward through Parliament, through the courts. This is an issue which seems to light up British politics more than any other. And Rachel Reeves has now put it back on the agenda. Of course, she will still face opposition. Environmental groups are outraged, and Sadiq Khan is not convinced. He released this statement today, the Mayor of London. Of course, I remain opposed to a new runway at Heathrow Airport because of the severe impact it will have on noise, air pollution, and meeting our climate change targets. I will scrutinise carefully any new proposals that come forward from Heathrow, including the impact it will have on people living in the area and the huge knock-on effects for our transport infrastructure. Despite the progress that's been made in the aviation sector to make it more sustainable, I'm simply not convinced that you can have hundreds of thousands of additional flights at Heathrow every year without a hugely damaging impact on our environment. Rachel Reeves, though, says there's nothing to worry about.
Heathrow themselves are clear that their proposal for expansion will meet strict rules on noise, air quality and carbon emissions. And we are already making great strides in transitioning to cleaner and greener aviation. Sustainable aviation fuel reduces CO2 emissions compared to fossil fuel by around 70%. At the start of this month, the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Mandate became law. And today I can announce that we are investing £63 million into the Advanced Fuels Fund over the next year.
So who should we believe? Can we have an expanded Heathrow and stick to our climate commitments and have nice air and not have too much noise in the local area? Well, earlier today, I spoke to someone with a very interesting perspective. Finlay Asher is a mechanical engineer who previously worked on plane engine designs for Rolls-Royce, but he left the company to start an environmental campaign group called Safe Landing. When I spoke to Finlay, I began by asking what he makes of Rachel Reeves' announcement today.
You have to sort of pinch yourself a little bit, because I remember back in 2018 where there was cross-party consensus on a climate emergency. I was working in the aviation industry and I thought, well, this is where there's going to be change. And now thinking, oh, that was like 6 years ago. And we're at the point where we're now announcing Heathrow expansion, the start of a potential planning process that will take many years, take probably more than a decade to build this. So we're looking out to almost 2040, by which point you expect the world to be very different. You expect us to travel very differently. If we are, real about taking climate action, you expect there to be major changes to the way that air transport works. And Heathrow is already one of the biggest airports in the world. It's sort of an example of the thing we need to move away from, which is long-haul international flights. I think for me, a real issue really is the narrative that's being used, the fact that we're still trotting out kind of misinformation that's justifying this. As an aerospace engineer, that's someone that likes to deal with evidence and facts and science, hearing some of the arguments used to justify this is really troubling as well. And I think something that we need to work on over the coming months as this situation develops.
What sort of examples of misinformation are you sort of thinking of there?
Well, just for example, just a kind of small one. I've been listening to radio interviews with ministers and people backing Heathrow over the past couple of days. And something that's been mentioned multiple times, which seems to be a line, is we've got all these aircraft circling above London, and by building an extra runway, they can land quicker, and this is therefore going to reduce pollution. That is basically saying, if we build more capacity, somehow there won't then be even more flights, and we'll still have aircraft and holding patterns just even more. I mean, that's basically an air traffic efficiency measure, and it's made more difficult the more planes there are in the sky, right? It's a bit like saying build more motorways and we'll get less cars. Just look at Los Angeles, got loads of motorways, everyone's driving a car, there's lots of congestion. So that's like a really obvious one, but more widely, the justifications for aviation expansion, you often hear carbon offsets being discussed. Those have been largely dismissed just as ineffective. But now we're talking about alternative fuels, what my industry likes to call sustainable aviation fuels. And that's now been taken on by politicians, and they say, well, we've had these developments and it means sustainable aviation is possible. We can grow and we can reduce emissions. And that's simply not true. Things like efficiency improvements and these alternative fuels we're trying to scale, we're just growing faster than we can scale these things. And that means emissions is going to increase, not decrease.
I'll read to you sort of the claims Rachel Reeves made about that point you just said there. So she said in her speech, we are already making great strides towards cleaner and greener aviation. And then she said, sustainable aviation fuel reduces CO2 emissions compared to fossil fuel by around 70%. Now, if you can, reducing emissions by 70%, that sounds huge. What's the story there? Why is Rachel Reeves not necessarily telling us the truth in that statement?
If you go back to 2008, Virgin Atlantic flew their first flight with aviation biofuels, and they said this is going to revolutionize the industry. It means we can get this growth and reduce emissions. That was many years ago now, almost 2 decades ago. And if you go back to then, they said that by 2020, we'd have 10% of jet fuel would be these alternative fuels. The reality is it was 0.01% in 2020, and we're still below 1% now. Now, the government set targets for 10% again for 2030, but we simply haven't built the refineries for these fuels yet. And we're actually really limited on the feedstock, so the input that would go into these. So unfortunately, we've only actually commercially developed one type of production pathway, and that one uses waste oil and fat, mostly used cooking oil. This is the easiest one to do because used cooking oil is really close to being a fuel already. It's relatively easy to convert. It's the cheapest one to do. The problem is there just isn't that much used cooking oil in the world. And this is something the industry acknowledges itself. So we could only really get to 2% of current jet fuel demand with that process. And then we're going to have to look elsewhere. It's not like solar or wind where you get economies of scale. The more you scale, the more you can build. We're just going to run out of feedstock. The UK already uses this feedstock for biodiesel. If you fill up your car, it's 5-10% biodiesel. We already actually import most of our used cooking oil for this from China and Malaysia because we don't have any ourselves. And that's obviously not very environmental. And the problem is we're putting a big demand on this. The US, the EU have also said that they're going to scale these fuels. And that means there's a big fraud supply chain where people are actually using palm oil or using soy and saying it's used cooking oil. So literally these countries are exporting more than they're collecting. And what does that lead to? Deforestation and more environmental issues. Now, if the industry was sitting here and they would say, well, we've got other pathways, we're going to use waste, biomass instead, like food waste, farm waste, forestry waste. These processes aren't developed yet. There's been various facilities that have tried to open. Some of them have shut down and failed because it's really too difficult to process the waste. You put in more energy than you get out. Also, if you think about food waste, really we need to be composting that, right? Turning it into fertilizer, putting it back in the soil and keeping the nutrients. So there's kind of issues wherever you go. I could talk to you for about an hour about this, so I'll probably stop there. But just two sort of headline figures I want to give you to help visualize this. Just with our current fuel demand, if we met that with biofuels, we'd need half of all UK farmland. If we use renewable electricity to make fuel, we need our entire electricity grid today just for aviation, and that's without growth. So it just shows you how difficult it is to scale these things, and the fact we're going to lead to sort of more environmental issues and social issues if we stay on that path. Obviously, if you constrain growth, you don't fly more, you reduce your fuel use, you make it easier. But we're going in the opposite direction with this announcement, aren't we?
Flying does seem like a really sort of awkward issue when it comes to the climate, because obviously climate politics is much easier if you can just say, you can basically continue your life as you were, but we're going to change the technology powering that. So obviously the transition from petrol powered to electric cars, or electricity powered by gas and coal to electricity powered by solar panels and wind farms. That's brilliant, right? You can just say your life can continue as it was, and we're just changing the technology. It might require some taxes here, some innovation there, but we can get there. With sort of air travel, people love it, right? I love it. I don't do it too often, but I like going on foreign holidays. I like a bit of sun that I can't get provided here in the UK on a consistent basis. What's the story here? Is your vision that we just sort of tell people that they can't fly, or they can't fly as much? Or is there some sort of sustainable third way we can be looking for?
I love flying too. I'm an aviation worker. It's what I'm passionate about. It's what my career is in. And so is all the other people in my group really care about this. And we want to be able to fly in the future. This is what it's about. It's about preserving that. So I think the first important thing to say is we do need behavior change, but this is not about the average person changing what they do. The average person doesn't fly that much. It's 1% of the planet that produces half of aviation emissions. That's where we need to see the behavior change. These are generally really high income, high emitters. People that have, are on air miles schemes and are flying 10, 20 times, 30 times a year, and if you think about private jets are booming at the moment, and they're the most carbon intensive way to fly. You have to be a millionaire or a billionaire to own one of those. You're not the average person. So that's the first thing. So when we need policy change, and actually by taxing those people, that's a great way to raise revenue to do the things you want to do. The government's like looking out for opportunities to raise finance so it can pay for the things it wants to pay to get growth. Well, here's a really good opportunity there. That's how you can make aviation work for the economy. But then in terms of, so if you set carbon budgets and then you say, well, actually, we need to try and fly as much as possible within that, there's I think the thing that we are really excited about is the opportunity to transform the way we travel. Now, there is zero carbon aircraft being developed. I'm going to be honest with you, they've got really different capability compared to aircraft today. They're going to be smaller, less passengers, flying less distance, probably slower. And the interesting thing about that is we could redistribute the way that we travel and be able to spread out our transport network and sort of move away from this concentrated system where we have over tourism in major capitals of the world, because that's where the big airports are and everyone goes to the same places. And also there's not really kind of equal access to air travel because of this as well. So we're really excited by the idea of actually starting to scale up these technologies, flying in a different way. And if you think about it as well, the political issue here around particularly like Heathrow, Gatwick, Luton, there's a lot of communities that live around there. It's not just the carbon pollution, it's the air pollution they're breathing in, it's the noise pollution that's keeping them awake early in the morning. These aircraft will produce less air pollution and less noise, so you're getting a kind of win-win for the environment and communities at the same time. Something, just a kind of practical, tangible solution is private airports around the UK. They're really well placed. If we phased out polluting private jets, use those existing airport hubs as the zero carbon aircraft hubs of the future, we could create this kind of distributed network using infrastructure we've already got. That's a way of kind of developing technology that will improve economic outcomes in the UK. We could maybe develop that technology, be pioneering it, and be able to export to the rest of the world as well. And that's the sort of economic strategy we'd like to see, rather than doubling down on business as usual expansion of massive airports.
Just sort of to expand a little bit, because I haven't really heard of this proposed solution before. So you're saying you can have zero carbon flights if they're smaller aircraft and they don't go very far. Is that solar powered? What's the story?
Battery electric, or there's hydrogen electric's also being developed. There's a company called Zero Avia that's attempting hydrogen here in the UK. There's Heart Aerospace that's based in Sweden. There's Elysian that's in the Netherlands. Generally, batteries are really heavy. That's the problem with aircraft. Hybrid electric is probably what you'll see it to begin with, and that kind of does actually make sense at an aircraft level. But yeah, you're looking at, to begin with, you're like 10, 20 people in an aircraft, maybe 50 at most, maybe traveling for 1 or 2 hours, right? So imagine if you're on, in Ireland is a good example. You're in Dublin or Belfast, you want to get to Western Europe. At the moment, if you want to travel by ground, you have to go the ferry, on the train, on the ferry, or through the tunnel. It takes a long time. Imagine if I'm in Scotland, if you're in Edinburgh and you want to get to Norway, really quite difficult if you're environmentally minded, trying to get the train all the way round. I've got cousins there. I've been looking at it. If you could fly, and that's something that could be done, is you could fly across there because it's not that far away. And as long as there's not many people in the aircraft, that works. But then you've actually got more aircraft, more jobs for pilots and cabin crew, right? So we're quite excited about the kind of knock-on effects in terms of more employment, actually. So we're flying less, we're decelerating our lives, and we're slowing down sort of how we travel, but actually we're creating more jobs. So that's quite exciting as well.
It does sound to me there's going to be a bit of a hard sell there to the public, because it sounds like it's going to be more expensive, right? Because it's going to be more labor intensive. You're not going to be able to go as far. So presumably you can't go sort of on a transatlantic flight. And I mean, you're suggesting also you might not be able to go to the big capital cities that people want to go to. So that's going to be, you're asking for some sacrifices there, I suppose.
The thing that we've got to think about is what flying will be possible in 10 years' time. I mean, really. So we if everybody took one long-haul flight a year, we'd blow our carbon budget immediately within 1 day. So that just simply isn't possible. I'm not saying we can't take long-haul flights, but we need to take those less frequently. Ideally, you travel less frequently, you travel less far, you travel less fast. Now, in terms of cost, the interesting thing about these aircraft is that they're easier to maintain, they're more simple, the actual aircraft cost could come down, and you might not actually be looking at something that's too expensive. But yeah, you won't be able to travel to the other side of the world. And if you are looking at long haul, it's possible that hydrogen aircraft are the thing that uses the least energy to travel really far. You need to completely redesign your aircraft for that. It's going to probably mean aircraft that look very different as well. And that's another concern we've got when we don't fully understand like the optimum configuration of that aircraft. And if that is the long-haul aircraft of the future, are we just going to spend the next 10, 15 years building a bigger Heathrow or Gatwick and then realize we've built the wrong thing? We needed different terminals, different gate layouts, and different charging infrastructure, and we sort of need to start again.
That was Finlay Asher speaking to me earlier today. Let's bring in Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, we spoke about Heathrow expansion on a recent stream. Both of us were in sort of two minds on the question. There were some people in our audience who, were a bit confused about that. Like, why are you in two minds about that? It seems climate change. It seems like you obviously shouldn't do this. Have you been swayed at all by that interview with Finlay Asher there?
I think there were lots of really important points that were brought up there. I think it's really difficult to come away from what we've just heard and then be full-throated in any kind of backing for expansions in aviation. It is something that has a considerable load of carbon. But I think there was a lot of dovetailing into the kind of stuff that we heard on last week's stream, which was that the things that are really damaging for the environment is the few people who take all of the flights. This is why I think that when we look at Heathrow Airport expansion, that is a really large problem regardless. That's the big issue that we have. And therefore, what we really need to do is be tackling the people who are the most frequent flyers. We need to be taxing private jets or banning private jets, massively engaging in higher taxation on people who are engaging in lots of frequent flights every year. Because regardless of whether we can accelerate ourselves into more low carbon flying in the future, those are the people who are still going to be the problem. And the people who have the money, the people who have the influence and the money to be able to afford to not do the ecologically friendly flying are going to want to continue to use jet fuel and fossil fuels. They're not going to give up their treats, right? A lot of the people who have the power globally to control how we do the international aviation industry, because it is an international industry just by default, because you're flying from country to country. A lot of those international companies and a lot of those international flyers are not going to want to compromise on the treats that have made their life as prosperous as possible. I mean, I'm someone who would technically be affected if we had to really cut down a lot of transatlantic flying in the future, as that's something I'm going to be having to do more often for personal reasons that I won't get into here. So if we're going to move just towards a more sustainable aviation, I'm personally willing to be able to compromise on that, because I believe in climate change and in reducing our emissions overall. However, I'm sure that a lot of the people in, for example, the United States, who are less climate conscious than we are, who are far less likely to engage in the kind of agreements on a lack of transatlantic flying that is necessary to be able to use sustainable aviation, they're going to be less likely to acquiesce to any global changes in how we do this stuff. So whilst I think the merit for the case against Heathrow expansion on the grounds that we've seen there in terms of the kind of flying that we want to do in the future, that seems to be sold to me pretty heavily now. But the question, of course, is how do you make this politically viable?
There are lots of things to worry about, Donald Trump being back in the White House, but among a crowded field, it wouldn't be completely unreasonable to most fear his effect on people's health, both inside and outside the United States. Now, that's in part because of his record the last time he had the job. For just one example, you might remember this.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light. And I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
Those were the days in the middle of a global pandemic, and you've got the president of the United States suggesting injecting bleach. Of course, in his second go at the job, Donald Trump has also basked in trampling on medical expertise. For example, here.
Withdrawing from the World Health Organization, sir.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Trump has since then defunded US-backed global health programs, including HIV treatment in South Africa. This is all very worrying stuff, and it could be about to get weirder because if he can bring on-side US senators, RFK Junior is about to become the health secretary of the United States. In the hearing, he was challenged over his position on vaccines.
You made almost $5 million from book deals, mostly promoting junk science. In 2021, in a book called The Measles Book, you wrote that parents had been, quote, misled into believing that measles is a deadly disease and that measles vaccines are necessary, safe, and effective. The reality is measles are in fact deadly and highly contagious, something that you should have learned after your lives contributed to the deaths of 83 people, most of them children, in a measles outbreak in Samoa. So my question here is, Mr. Kennedy, is measles deadly, yes or no?
The death rate from measles historically in this country in 1963, the year before the introduction of the vaccine, was 1 in 10,000.
Now, this is one of those, watching RFK ones is often difficult because you often don't know if what he's saying is true or not. I didn't know what the death rate was before the vaccine. He is technically right here, although I don't know if it necessarily has the implications he says it does. So this is from the CDC, so the Center for Disease Control. They say, in the decade before, I should say the vaccine, nearly all children got measles by the time they were 15 years old. It is estimated 3 to 4 million people in the United States are infected each year. Among reported measles cases each year, an estimated 400 to 500 people died. 48,000 were hospitalized, and 1,000 suffered encephalitis, which is swelling of the brain. So as I say, that does work out as a death rate of 1 in 10,000. So RFK is technically right. That's still an outcome you want to avoid, though, right? You could vaccinate everyone with barely any side effects and avoid 48,000 children going to hospital and 500 of them dying, right? That's really bad. You can't just say, oh, it's only 1 in 10,000, so it doesn't really matter. You want to avoid that outcome. The Samoa case there was mentioned by the senator, and that does show why vaccines really do matter. So after vaccination rates fell on the island, an outbreak in 2019 caused 83 deaths. RFK stands accused of helping to spread vaccine skepticism before that outbreak, and his defense in front of senators wasn't impressive.
You cannot find a single Samoan who will say, I didn't get a vaccine because of Bobby Kennedy. I went in June of 2019. The measles outbreak started in August. Oh, clearly I had nothing to do with the measles.
So this is someone who's, he's at a confirmation hearing to become the Secretary of Health, very significant job. He says, how could I have had anything to do with the outbreak? Look, I'm accused of having spread vaccine skepticism and that contributing to not enough people getting vaccinated and then an outbreak happening. But I went there in June and the outbreak was in August. So how can that work? Well, June is before August, right? How the cause and effect here is people don't get vaccinated, then you get an outbreak. So if you visited 2 months before the outbreak, that does not prove you had nothing to do with the outbreak, right? I mean, before I'm going to take any lessons from this guy on the safety or otherwise of vaccines, I would like to think he can work out the passage of time, to use a phrase from Kamala Harris. RFK, therefore, is obviously not a man you should trust. But the hearing, I have to say, didn't universally go against his favor, including this robust response to being called a conspiracy theorist.
Are you a conspiracy theorist?
That is a pejorative, Senator, that's applied to me. Mainly to keep me from asking difficult questions of powerful interests. I was told that I was a conspiracy theorist. That label was applied to me because I said that the vaccines, the COVID vaccine, didn't prevent transmission and it wouldn't prevent infection, when the government was telling people, Americans, that it would. I was saying that because I was looking at the monkey studies in May of 2020. I was called a conspiracy. Now everybody admits it. I was called a conspiracy theorist because I said red dye caused cancer. And now FDA has acknowledged that and banned it. I was called a conspiracy theorist because I said fluoride lowered IQ. Last week, JAMA published a meta-review of 87 studies saying that there's a direct inverse correlation between IQ loss.
All right, so I'm going to assume
I could go on for about a week.
So, RFK isn't obviously wrong on those fronts. I do often think, conspiracy theorist gets bandied around. You can get a conspiracy theorist if you can get called a conspiracy theorist, if you think there's an Israel lobby, for example, but there is one. You got called a conspiracy theorist if you thought that COVID might have leaked from a lab. That now seems like, at least it's 50-50. And on the points that RFK mentioned there, many of it, was simply correct, right? People with COVID vaccines can still pass on the virus, even if you are at a reduced reduction of spreading it, and it's still well worth having it because you're less likely to go to hospital. But it didn't have the same effects on transmission people initially believed. He mentioned red dye. Red dye number 3 is presumably what RFK Junior was talking about. That was banned by the US Food and Drug Agency over its link to cancer. That was just a few weeks ago. It gave mice cancer. I think they've said they don't know if it gives humans cancer, but they've banned it nonetheless. And a large-scale meta-analysis by the US National Institute of Health at the beginning of January did show that levels of fluoride in drinking water over 1.5 milligrams per litre is associated with lower IQ in children. We should note the average amount of fluoride in US water is 0.7 milligrams, so lower than the level they say can lower IQ. But those concerns about the side effects of fluoride do mean that in most of Europe, we don't add fluoride to the water supply, right? So RFK's opposition is by no means irrational. He's suggesting that the Americans do what the Europeans do on the question of fluoride. Helena, I find it, really difficult in a way covering RFK Jr. because I don't trust the guy, right? Especially on vaccines. I think he's do I want to say malicious? I don't know. I don't want to impute motives, but I think he's, reprehensible, actually, when it comes to vaccines. There are other issues that he gets called a conspiracy theorist for where maybe he has a point. And so it means that, well, I suppose why it's so hard work is because everything he says, you have to do loads of research. And then there's sort of some people saying, oh, maybe that is reasonable. Some people saying that's not reasonable. It's difficult to dismiss him out of hand. But there are so many examples of where he does seem like a danger to public health. How do you sort of approach this?
I mean, I think that in most cases with people like this, a broken clock can be right twice a day. And in some cases, I think that whilst the surface level claims that he's been making on a lot of these things have at least like a small amount of merit, but those points that he was using were justifications for policy prescriptions and for public messaging that was like largely huge amounts of which had huge amounts of negative social utility attached to it. So when he was saying things like, oh, well, they don't stop transmission, the vaccines don't at all stop transmission. And whilst there were some things saying that we totally would be able to stop transmission, even coming out from Anthony Fauci, there was the reduction in transmission was the main point that was being pushed. And RFK wasn't using it as such a broad point to try and get better public knowledge over whether or not you were going to be completely unable to pass things on with regards to having been vaccinated for the coronavirus, for COVID. He was making it as a point to not get the vaccine in the first place. So whilst there was a small grain of truth, we actually learned pretty early on from some peer-reviewed studies that were being done about the viral loads that were being transmitted from people who had been vaccinated twice, that they were actually much less likely to transmit things than they were before. The viral loads were much smaller. And that doesn't just mean that you can't pass it on. It also means that when you do pass it on, people who do contract it get less sick and get better quicker. So whilst there may be a grain of truth to the thing that he was trying to put forward, which was this idea that, well, actually anybody who says that you can't pass on at all if you've been vaccinated, it's not true. That's never really been true about vaccines broadly. I think there was a poor understanding about vaccinations and epidemiology before the pandemic made it at the forefront of everyone's discussion. For example, everyone trying to say that you can't get infected if you're vaccinated was a kind of common trope, when actually what it means is that you just don't notice it and therefore it makes you less vulnerable to the overall effect, which is why people were getting frustrated when they were still getting at least a little bit sick having been vaccinated, because the whole point of vaccinations is that you get a critical mass of overall levels of vaccination and then it can't transmit enough to be able to maintain a broad level of transmission amongst the public. So the point that he was making, regardless of its kind of base level veracity, had such a giant level to which it was socially negative in terms of utility. That is the real problem here. And then when it comes to fluorides, like the prescription that he wants as head of health and human services, it's just strip away all of the fluoride, right? So regardless of whether or not we do see some studies that show things that are negative at a certain level, that's not a justification for getting rid of everything or for going cold turkey. It's about ensuring that when we do have legislation that's coming out of the FDA and the CDC that is proportional to the evidence, rather than what he uses it for. So personally, I am concerned, is using it whilst he may not be a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist in the broadest sense of the term. It's useful for a grift. It is making outlandish and or vexatious claims, as far as I'm concerned, that causes public panic and causes people to have lack of trust in places like the CDC and the FDA, which, as far as I'm concerned, have a pretty good track record in terms of having the society's interests at heart. And part of Trump populism is trying to give people a lack of trust in overall institutions. And whilst there are plenty of political institutions that have had really poor track records in America, and the public in America's skepticism of those is very, very justified in terms of science and in terms of that kind of stuff where experts are involved, the level to which public trust is being undermined is really, really dangerous. Like when you try and use these vaccine skeptic stuff to talk about big pharma, you're redirecting the real problem of big pharma, which is corporate profit, it is capital interest, it is private profit over public good that's the problem. Whereas they're trying to imply that it's individual scientists that are the ones that are the problem here, who are being underhanded with the vaccines, when a lot of these people are employed to do what they want to do. And it's the profit motive at the top, the CEOs, the shareholders, the boards of directors, who are taking policies that aren't in the public's interests. So that's a really problematic redirection of the problem towards broad social consensus over scientific things that we really need to have broad social trust in for them to be socially viable.
I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I would say I wouldn't necessarily assume everything the FDA does is sort of in the best interest of the American people, because they will also be subject to lobbying, right? And it was the FDA presumably that sort of approved the opioids that ended up getting so many people addicted. So I mean, I imagine there are sort of very valid criticisms of those organizations in terms of what they do approve and what they don't approve. But I suppose with RFK Junior, and this is what I this is kind of how I approach lots of things now, on the left, on the right, on all kinds of issues. If I suspect someone is, they have their sort of conceived ambition or line, and all they do is cherry pick any kind of data that they think supports it, I don't really trust him. And so with RFK Junior, he doesn't like vaccines. And so what he does is cherry pick any kind of data which makes it seem like vaccines are dangerous or pointless. So with COVID, he didn't like the COVID vaccine because he doesn't like vaccines. And so what he talks loads and loads about is how they didn't stop transmission. Now, okay, they didn't stop transmission, that's fine. But what they did do is they massively sort of reduced the risk of going to hospital and dying. And that's why we managed to reopen society and we can all live normally again, right? Because we had those vaccines. So if I feel like someone is willing to sort of look at the part of the story that might be being missed by the mainstream media or the establishment, like the lab leak theory or like COVID, the vaccine not stopping transmission, or, numerous things we could sort of talk about here, great. So long as you're also interested in the other side of the ledger. And with RFK Jr., I think he's only interested in that evidence which backs up his preconceived idea, which is why I don't trust the guy. Let's look at one more clip of RFK Jr., because separate from healthcare, this was an interesting exchange with Bernie Sanders.
I happen to believe that climate change is real, it's an existential threat, and it is a healthcare issue. Donald Trump thinks that it is a hoax originating in China. Question is, in your judgment, is climate change a hoax or is it real, causing devastating problems?
President Trump and I, from the beginning, from our first meeting, agreed to disagree on that issue. I believe climate change is existential. My job is to make Americans healthy again.
All right, you believe that you disagree with Trump, you don't think climate change is a hoax, is what I'm hearing.
My job here is to make
just
Americans
asking you that,
healthy.
Mr. Kenny, not a trick question.
I answered your question, Senator Sanders.
Okay, you disagree with the president on that.
I answered your question.
Okay.
That was quite a good answer. He disagrees with the president. I mean, you might say if you disagree with the president that strongly, then why have you gone and worked for him and campaigned for him? I think that would be a legitimate objection you could have to RFK Jr. But that answer was quite good. And I suppose what's interesting here as well is how difficult to place historically RFK Jr. has been, because Obama actually considered putting him forward as the chair of the Environmental Protection Agency, because he was a lawyer who sort of campaigned on environmental issues. But Obama thought he might be a bit too radical on the left and people wouldn't sort of, or, the Senate wouldn't go along with it. And now he's being proposed by Donald Trump on these health issues. I think he probably has got a bit more sort of conspiratorial and extreme since then. And that it's not just that sort of politics has changed. This is the last clip we're going to show you on this story. It's not from the Senate hearing. It's instead a video uploaded before the Senate hearing by the cousin of RFK Jr. She's called Caroline Kennedy. And as I say, she released this statement just before that hearing began.
He lacks any relevant government, financial, management, or medical experience. His views on vaccines are dangerous and willfully misinformed. These facts alone should be disqualifying. But he has personal qualities related to this job, which for me pose even greater concern. I've known Bobby my whole life. We grew up together. It's no surprise that he keeps birds of prey as pets, because Bobby himself is a predator. He's always been charismatic, able to attract others through the strength of his personality, his willingness to take risks and break the rules. I watch his younger brothers and cousins follow him down the path of drug addiction. His basement, his garage, his dorm room were always the center of the action, where drugs were available, and he enjoyed showing off how he put baby chickens and mice in a blender to feed to his hawks.
I really wasn't expecting that final line. Elena, should it matter in a Senate hearing whether or not the applicant, the person, the candidate for the position used to enjoy blending chicks and what else was it, mice to feed to his hawks?
I mean, it's not a great look. I mean, if I'm honest, I don't think it's totally 100% relevant to the Senate confirmation hearings. But if you really want to paint a picture that somebody isn't fit for their job, putting the public consciousness against them for things like blending animals, probably something that is going to have a lot of input in this. But when it comes to the actual confirmation here, a more serious point, is that first of all, I guess Donald Trump was elected basically with this mandate. He went into this election and you understood he had really close links to people like this. So the Senate confirmation hearings, you have to really get to the point of something that properly undermines his actual role, that would give the senators the impetus to not appoint him or to not confirm him in this position. I personally think, from what we've heard already today, there is plenty of evidence to stop him from doing that. The question, of course, is of whether or not the Republican senators, who have a very small majority in the Senate, actually want to go ahead and do that. If a couple of them want to undermine their leadership and go against it, then they have every position to be able to stop his confirmation. The issue, of course, is that Republicans are beholden to one thing, just like a lot of Democrats as well, and that's money. There is a billionaire called Nicole Shanahan who is actually outwardly saying that she will throw huge amounts of money to primary any person who doesn't confirm RFK. And this is a really big problem. If you have billionaires who are nutty enough to agree with some of the bullshit that comes out of RFK's mouth, it doesn't matter whether there is broad levels of disagreement with his political positions, because you can insert people into government through huge amounts of campaign financing and lobbying and loads of different ways of getting people to do what you want to do as a billionaire with undue influence. And this is, of course, one of the biggest problems here. There was huge amounts of money behind Donald Trump, behind RFK, behind the kind of senators who might end up doing his confirmation by being threatened through billionaire involvement in politics. And you've got to look at the kind of the margin senators, as far as Republicans are concerned, that are closest to the center, whether they're going to break ranks or not. You look at Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, elected on a mandate in their swing-ish states on being the moderate voices in the room. And if these people are just going to acquiesce to billionaires trying to buy elections against them in future, then this doesn't look particularly great in terms of the overall utility of what American governance is going to look like.
Russian-Israeli oligarch Roman Abramovich is thought to be worth around $10 billion. That, of course, is the wealth we know about, and how exactly he made that fortune has always been somewhat mysterious. But we do know that the billionaire is no stranger to financial scandal. The former Chelsea Football Club owner has admitted paying out billions in exchange for political favours in the former Soviet Union. He's been linked to a scandal involving a fraudulent $5 billion loan from the IMF, and he's been accused of donating over $100 million to a group supporting Israeli settlers on Palestinian territory. Now, it's no surprise to learn he's not a good guy. After all, he's a billionaire. But life hasn't always been easy for the world's 155th richest man. In 2022, the UK government imposed sanctions on Abramovich over his links to Russian President Vladimir Putin following the start of the Ukraine war. A month later, the island of Jersey, a tax haven, froze £5.5 billion worth of his assets, while 12 luxury properties in France were seized by the French authorities, also over his links to Putin. God, imagine having one luxury property seized and then having 12. The tragedy, all 12 luxury properties seized. Now, though, Abramovich is facing a new financial headache, and given it's the end of January, it's a familiar one for anyone who has to fill out a self-assessment tax return. Yes, it's a surprise bill from HMRC. That's because it turns out Abramovich might owe the taxman around £1 billion in unpaid taxes. Who hasn't forgotten to pay the taxman a little billion? A joint investigation between The Guardian, the BBC, and the Centre for Investigative Journalism has revealed this. Leaked papers and court filings shed new light on how the income from a $6 billion cash pile amassed by one of the world's richest men was managed. The former owner of Chelsea FC entrusted nearly half of his fortune to more than 200 hedge funds, including some of the world's most prestigious money managers, using a circuitous structure routed through Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands, the files show. The structures endured until at least 2022, when Abramovich was among a group of powerful Kremlin allies hit with sanctions by Western governments in response to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, what's being alleged as potential tax evasion revolves around that complex corporate structure called the Key Grove structure, after an Abramovich-linked Virgin Islands holding company. It was allegedly used to manage Abramovich's affairs. And at the heart of it is this man, Eugene Schweidler, seen here with Abramovich, sometimes described as Abramovich's right-hand man. Schwilder is a fellow Russian who moved to the UK in 2004 and became a citizen in 2010 under the Golden Visa scheme, where you could basically buy, residency here if you had enough dirty money. The question of whether tax is liable is governed by a simple rule. And first, find the person who has what HMRC calls the highest level of control. So in this case, that's alleged to be Schweidler, who appears to have controlled many of Abramovich's investment decisions. Second, work out where the person making those decisions was located. According to the leaked papers and court filings, if Schweidler was controlling the investment, he appears to have been doing so from the UK. If that's all true, what does it mean for Abramovich? This is from The Guardian. Analysis of the data suggests that between 2004 and 2018, profits made by the key growth structure could be as high as $3.8 billion. If this is the case, the amount of any unpaid UK tax could be £536 million. That's according to analysis examined by tax experts. Were HMRC to conclude that Abramovich's companies had failed to pay this sum, they would also be charged interest on the total avoided, amounting to at least £145 million. Companies that fail to pay tax and do not disclose this voluntarily are also subject to late payment penalties of up to 70% of the unpaid sum if the failure is deemed deliberate. Depending on the severity of the case, HMRC could demand between £651 million and £1 billion, analysis suggests. If a liability is due, some could be time barred due to the length of time that has passed. Lawyers for Schweidler have denied him being knowingly or negligently involved in an unlawful scheme to avoid paying tax, as you'd imagine they would. But the UK scheme is just one vehicle that Abramovich is alleged to have used to evade tax. There's another story connected to this one that's even more creative. This is the Eclipse mega yacht. Looks gorgeous. Valued at £700 million. It was bought by Abramovich in 2010. It boasts 2 helicopter pads because one is just not enough. 24 guest cabins, 2 swimming pools, several hot tubs, and a disco hall. It even comes with its own submarine, as well as missile launchers and a missile detection system. Are you allowed to have missile launchers on just a luxury yacht? I don't know. I don't think you should be. This is just one of the 5 luxury yachts bought by Abramovich. They really are taking a piss of us, aren't they? One of 5 luxury yachts held by Abramovich during the 2000s. It was allegedly used in another tax dodge involving a complex corporate structure. This is from the BBC, who've been studying the same batch of leaked papers. The files reveal how Mr. Abramovich's advisors helped him avoid paying huge tax bills on the yacht's running costs in the EU waters by using companies to hire them out to himself or other companies he controlled. Documents show how the 5 yachts were leased to a company in Cyprus called Blue Ocean Yacht Management, which chartered them onto a handful of companies in the British Virgin Islands that appeared independent, but which were all, in fact, controlled by Mr. Abramovich. In other words, the allegation is that Abramovich avoided tax by hiring his luxury yachts from himself and then writing off their running costs as a business expense. If true, Abramovich could have avoided paying millions and potentially tens of millions of tax and VAT. Lawyers working for Abramovich have said that he denies, quote, any allegation that he had any knowledge or was personally responsible or liable for any alleged deception of any government authority to evade tax. I wonder how much you get paid as a lawyer to just sort of give the BBC a statement. Anything you're accusing him of, he denies. That which seems to be what this denial amounts to, right? I'm sure they're getting paid millions. What do they charge by the hour to send the BBC that email? I would send the BBC that email. Some of our elected representatives, as you'd imagine, have questions for Abramovich. Joe Powell MP chairs a cross-party parliamentary group on anti-corruption and responsible tax. He told The Guardian this: I'd like to see HMRC thoroughly investigate whether corporation tax or any other taxes are owed by Abramovich on these operations. More widely, I think it's a good test case for whether HMRC and other regulators have the enforcement capacity they need to make cases of this nature. To be fair, I could have written that statement as well. If you're a lawyer, you send the BBC an email saying he denies any charges you might throw at him. And if you're an MP, you say this should be investigated thoroughly. Helena, I suppose presumably this should be investigated thoroughly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, the one thing I would say though, I think this does show kind of the failure that we have of the social democratic idea of governance, which is that well, it doesn't really matter if we don't have too many guardrails on capitalism and free markets as a system, because what we can do is we can just tax things back and then redistribute from there. That's one of Gary Stevenson's big prescriptions that he's got. Someone I'm a big fan of, which is that once these rich people have all of these assets, all you need to do is tax them back, and then you can use them to be able to recoup assets for the people and for the state. One of the big problems of this, of course, is that there have been and have historically been so many ways. Once these people have managed to accrue this huge amount of wealth, once we do this deregulation, once we do this kind of reduce the overall level of taxation for people who are on high assets, who have high incomes, so that they can then amass these huge amounts of wealth that they historically have done since we reduced our tax levels and deregulated our economies broadly in the 1979 onwards, is that once they are this rich, they find infinite number of ways of being able to put things through different system to avoid different kinds of taxation, and then of course can get in pretty favorable positions with politicians where the actual legislation that could theoretically be there to bring these people to heel doesn't actually get pulled forward. I mean, of course, in this specific case, there's going to be a protracted legal discussion. This is going to 10, 20 years after a lot of these things have happened. So it has taken a very long time, having him done all of this potential tax avoidance, this alleged tax avoidance, to potentially actually get this recouped after a lot of the damage has already been done to a pretty large extent. Like the issue, of course, in my concern is rather than levels of taxation, it's levels of ownership. And we've allowed a cohort of incredibly rich people to have huge amounts of ownership. We saw what happened in the Soviet Union turning into Russia with the shock therapy that allowed Roman Abramovich to be able to amass this huge amounts of wealth. But that's basically what we've done in the UK and the United States too, especially in the UK, as we had a big flash sale in the 80s that gave us our own set of oligarchs in a similar fashion. And they have many ways of being able to loop around the levels of taxation to be able to claw our assets back. And so we're going to have to reclaim ownership somehow. And that's going to involve pretty radical ideas of how we change policy to do that, because we had a system. There was literally part of HMRC that was created under the Conservative government too. Like this wasn't like a lefty government that did this. There was a specific department of theirs which was there to crack down very heavily on corporate levels of tax avoidance. And there were pretty hefty fines and penalties for people who were part of these institutions if they didn't whistleblow to the government on potential levels of tax avoidance in their corporations. How many people might have actually been brought to heel by this particular arm of government since it was set up in 2016? Zero. Absolutely nobody. So, of course, we could elect politicians that are going to be pretty heavy-handed in terms of dealing with tax avoidance. Probably we will get more of that. Reeves talked pretty heavily about closing the tax gap at the last election. But this is a sticking plaster solution, one that Keir Starmer says that he doesn't like, on top of a really kind of deep cut in terms of our public finances and our public realm, which is about too many people too few people owning too much of the assets of this country. And this is a good start, but things are going to have to get more serious and more radical if we're going to have a proper redistribution of wealth in this country.
I just want a small corner of one of his 5 super yachts to relax in. Looks lovely, doesn't it? Even if it does make me a little bit infuriated, but there we are. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you very much, as always.
And thank you guys for watching. Come back tomorrow for another live show from 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.